Anne Boleyn's sister and brother. Thank you to Love and Pies for sponsoring this video. Anne Boleyn is one of the most famous women in history. Her meteoric rise from minor noble to Queen of England, and her even faster downfall to a beheading in the Tower of London, is the stuff of legend, and the subject of too many novels and dramas to count. But two important characters in Anne's story often get sidelined. Her sister Mary was a mistress of King Henry VIII before she was, and bore him 2 children. And her younger brother George also had an impressive rise at court, only to fall with Anne when they were accused of incest together. He was beheaded 2 days before she was. I'm at Hever Castle south of London, where the Boleyn siblings spent their youth, to better understand Queen Anne's childhood and get to know her fascinating and tragic sister and brother. The Boleyn family came from modest origins. Their name, alternately spelled Boleyn or Boleyn with a Y, may have derived from the French city of Bologna. Anne's great-grandfather, Geoffrey, rose to wealth as a haberdasher, then rose to power as Lord Mayor of London. He wed Lady Anne Hoe, the daughter of a baron, and raised his family near to the aristocracy, though they did not yet have a title. Geoffrey purchased 2 estates, Blickling in Norfolk and Hever Castle in Kent. At both locations, he built comfortable and modern manor houses for his family. Here at Hever, he repaired a 13th century stone bailey and built a modern dwelling within the walls. Geoffrey's son William continued in his father's success. He married Lady Margaret Butler, daughter of the Earl of Ormond, and was knighted at the coronation of King Richard III. He used as his sigil 3 black bulls' heads on a white field with a red chevron. The design was likely chosen as a pun on the spelling of the Boleyn name, and to represent bravery and valor. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard and seized the throne, the Boleyns switched allegiance. Henry VII was keen to fill his court with men who possessed intelligence and merit rather than just noble blood. This was the perfect opportunity for Thomas Boleyn, a bright man who spoke multiple languages. He became a courtier and diplomat. He escorted the king's daughter, Princess Margaret, to Scotland to wed King James IV, and he attended the wedding of Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. Thomas was created a knight at the coronation of King Henry VIII. He and the young king got on especially well, as both were mad for jousting. Around 1498, Thomas wed Elizabeth Howard, eldest daughter of the Earl of Surrey. She served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth of York, and then to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth was pregnant at least 6 times, but the details of her deliveries were not well recorded. It's still not clear exactly when Mary and Anne were born. Eldest daughter, Mary, was born around 1499. Elizabeth delivered 2 sons, Thomas and Henry, who both died around 1506. Anne was next, probably born in 1501, and George was the youngest surviving child, born in 1504. All of the children were delivered at Blickling Hall. But in 1505, Thomas inherited Hever Castle from his father, and the family moved there as it was more convenient to the royal court in London. The 3 surviving Boleyn children, Mary, Anne, and George, were thick as thieves. They spent their childhoods together, here on the grounds and in the gardens of Hever Castle. As their parents were often away at court, they were looked after by a nurse, Mrs. Mary Orchard. The children took after their father in intelligence, charisma, and ambition, and they were eager to impress him. Thomas was a humanist and brought in tutors to educate his daughters as well as his son. The new queen, Catherine of Aragon, was herself highly educated, and intellectual women were just becoming fashionable in England. Knowing how to converse in French, play chess, read poetry, play music, sing, and dance would help the daughters secure coveted places as maids of honor, contract noble marriages, and bolster their family's prestige. They also learned archery, falconry, riding, and hunting. George, like his father, trained as a knight and loved jousting. If you enjoy stories of romance and intrigue, then I think you'll adore playing Love and Pies. The game is free to download on your phone or tablet. Help Amelia rebuild her family's cafe by playing a relaxing merged game to make baked goods for customers. And enjoy the telenovela meets sitcom storyline as she reconnects with her hunky high school sweetheart and solves the mystery of who burnt down the cafe. All in the charming town of Appleton with its host of diverse characters. I really enjoy playing merged games when I need a break, and this is one of the best designed and enjoyable I've tried. The game stays fresh with new events, challenges, and storylines released regularly. Download Love and Pies now with my link below. And now, back to history. Anne was not the stereotypical middle child. She stood out from her siblings and was the first to leave home at the age of 11. Her father secured for her a place as a maid of honor to Archduchess Margaret of Austria. She was the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and she had been given the position as ruler of the Low Countries. It's not clear why Anne was favored over her older sister Mary. Perhaps their father felt Anne was better suited for the task. Once Anne arrived in Austria, her education was greatly expanded under Duchess Margaret's tutelage. Margaret was an incredibly intelligent, powerful, and progressive woman for her time. She had a special library just for the edification of her ladies. Margaret introduced young Anne to early Enlightenment philosophy, feminist ideas, and, most significantly, the Protestant Reformation. Margaret was impressed with her charming, bright, and mature new ward. She wrote to Anne's father thanking him for doing her the favor of sending a young lady so presentable and so pleasant, considering her youthful age. After 18 months with Margaret, Anne was given an even more prestigious position as a maid of honor to Henry VIII's sister Mary, who was about to wed Louis XII of France. There, 13-year-old Anne was reunited with her sister Mary, now 15, who had also been granted a place in the royal entourage. This tapestry depicts the wedding of Mary Tudor and Louis XII. The characters in the background are not specifically identified, but one might imagine that two of the young ladies were Mary and Anne Boleyn, watching this lavish royal spectacle with awe. But the French royal marriage was far from happy. Mary Tudor was just 18 and was horrified and heartsick at having to wed a 52-year-old king. Her brother mollified her by promising that she could choose her second husband. Despite 2 previous marriages, King Louis had no living sons and was desperate to get Mary pregnant. The king died after just 3 months of matrimony. Courtiers whispered that he had expired from overexertion in the bedchamber, but it was more likely gout. Henry VIII forgot his promise and began negotiating for his sister to wed another old king, so she eloped with the man she truly loved, the Duke of Suffolk. After her departure, the Boleyn sisters remained in France to serve the next queen, 15-year-old Claude. They likely both attended the Field of Cloth of Gold, a diplomatic summit between Henry VIII and King Francis I. This may have been where they first met the English king. Fair Mary was considered the more beautiful of the sisters, while Anne was the more astute. It was rumored that Mary conducted affairs with several men, including King Francis. He referred to her as the English mare, my hackney, and a very great whore, the most infamous of all. Historians believe that Mary's reputation was far worse than her actual promiscuity. Nevertheless, her father decided she needed to get out of France. He took her back to England and secured her a place as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. He also secured her marriage to William Carey, a wealthy and influential courtier. King Henry was a guest at the wedding and gave the couple a suspiciously large sum of money as a gift, possibly buying the compliance of the husband in the seduction of the wife. At some point, Mary became the king's mistress, though when and how remains unclear. Anne remained at the sophisticated French court for a further 3 years. There she gained knowledge of art, dance, fashion, music, poetry, and the flirtatious art of courtly love. Rumors later plagued Anne that she had learned a variety of French sexual tricks, which she used to ensnare the king. But in reality, she lived a sheltered life in Queen Claude's inner circle. She spent most of her time cloistered away caring for the queen during her 7 back-to-back pregnancies, and wouldn't have had much free time for love affairs. Anne did, however, become friends with King Francis's sister, Marguerite de Navarre, an outspoken humanist and evangelical reformer. The princess encouraged Anne in her growing Protestant convictions. In 1522, Anne rejoined Mary in England. She made her debut dancing in a pageant. Ladies dressed in white satin played the 7 virtues. Mary was kindness and Anne perseverance. They were guarded by a choir of boys representing vice. The king and 7 other lords in blue satin and cloth of gold had a food fight with the boys in order to win the ladies' freedom. After the jolly revelry, the lords led the ladies to dance. There is no indication that Anne made an impression on Henry at this time. He was still in the midst of his affair with her sister, Mary. She gave birth to 2 children. Both were claimed by her husband, but are believed to have been sired by the king. The sisters were also reunited with their brother. As the only son, George Boleyn was expected to follow in his father's footsteps and work as a courtier, diplomat, and politician. He was introduced to King Henry during the Christmas festivities of 1514. 10-year-old George so impressed Henry that he was granted the coveted position of royal page. He may have spent some time in France with his sisters, which would explain his perfect French, but he spent most of his adolescence at Henry's court and attended the University of Oxford. Once the Boleyn siblings were reunited in their late teens, early 20s, they fell back into their childhood bond. They made a witty, attractive, and popular faction at court. Like his father, George was a talented courtier and was counted among His Majesty's favorite companions. Privy Purse expenses mention numerous large payouts to George for wagers won against the king at bowls, tennis, cards, and archery. He likely lost even more, as those who bested Henry too often didn't stay long in his company. George wrote poetry and did translations. He had a reputation as a rake. One of his enemies claimed that he forced widows and deflowered maidens, though this is generally interpreted to mean he was a Lothario, not an actual rapist. Some historians theorize that George had homosexual relationships as well, though there is no solid evidence of this. In 1523, the Boleyns were finally rewarded for their faithful service to the crown with a peerage of their own. Thomas was elevated to Viscount Rochford and made a Knight of the Garter. 20-year-old George wed the king's second cousin, Jane Parker. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, the daughter of a baron and one of the beauties of court. The couple spent their honeymoon here at Hever, but the relationship seems to have been unhappy, and in their 12 years together, they had no children. George was appointed a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and then royal cupbearer, both positions which put him close to the king and came with generous salaries. It is often assumed that the Boleyns achieved their prominence at court only because Anne slept her way to the top, but in fact they had achieved all this before she gained the king's attention. By 1526, Henry's affair with Mary had come to an end, and he turned his attention to her sister. Mary was a more classical beauty, but Anne had wit, charm, and sophistication in spades, though many commented on her eyes, which were black, beautiful, and captivating. Anne became a star and was pursued by several eligible courtiers. But soon, the king's aggressive flirtations made it clear that he intended to have her in his bed. However, she had learned from her sister's missteps and had no intention of becoming a royal mistress, bearing an illegitimate child or two and then being tossed aside. Anne recruited her mother in her quest to avoid the king. Whenever His Majesty tried to get her alone, Elizabeth was always there playing chaperone. Anne fled the court and the king's advances and returned here to her childhood home at Hever. It was here that she received suggestive letters from Henry. Henry went so far as to pursue Anne to Hever. Thomas Boleyn was an ambitious man, though many dramas have portrayed him as a devious character who pushed Mary and Anne into the king's bed. In reality, he loved his children dearly and didn't want to see either of his daughters disgraced as a royal mistress. But Thomas and Elizabeth couldn't refuse the honor of a royal visit. They put Henry up in their own bedchamber. His Majesty was paranoid about his own safety and had this lock installed on his chamber door. The king spared little thought for the great expense feeding and entertaining his royal entourage cost the Boleyn family. Anne wanted to marry a man of her own station, but saying no to the king was not an easy thing. Eventually, she agreed to sleep with Henry, if he would marry her first. Once Anne was the king's fiancée, the Boleyn family fortunes really took off. Her father Thomas was elevated even higher to Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond. He passed his previous title of Viscount Rochford to his son George, who was knighted and appointed governor of Bedlam Hospital, a profitable position. He was also granted the Palace of Beaulieu, which he and Jane lavishly decorated with a chapel, tennis court, and a bathroom with hot and cold running water. At just 25, George was sent on his first diplomatic mission to France. Despite his youth, he was a charismatic ambassador and made a favorable impression on Francis I. His first mission was to encourage the French to support Henry's divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry thought that he could secure an annulment in a matter of months, but he soon found that the Pope was against him, and the ordeal took a further 7 years. Anne's casting as the virtue of perseverance became all too fitting. In order to appease his fiancée's impatience, Henry granted her the title of Marquess of Pembroke. She was one of only 2 peeresses in her own right in the Tudor era, and she outranked her own father. Much of her father and brother's careers from this point on were dedicated to securing the king's divorce, and thus Anne's royal marriage. Henry's argument for annulling his marriage to Catherine was that she had been married to his older brother, Arthur, who died at the age of 15. The same logic would have made it sinful for Henry to marry Anne, the sister of his former mistress and mother of 2 of his children. The king was eager to sweep his old girlfriend under the rug, so Mary was sent away from court. In 1528, her husband William died of the sweating sickness, leaving her in considerable debt. Anne secured for her sister a widow's pension and provided for her nephew's education, but she kept Mary at arm's length. With Mary on the outs, Anne and George grew closer. They both had strong Protestant leanings. He presented her with 2 religious texts, which he had translated from French into English and dedicated to the Right Honourable Lady Marchioness of Pembroke. Her most loving and friendly brother sendeth greetings. George encouraged Anne to show the king a religious pamphlet, and while Anne had a great influence on Henry's ultimate decision to break with the Catholic Church, George also had some sway in His Majesty's mind. The Viscount was a talented debater, and it was he whom Henry chose to argue his case for royal supremacy over the Church. George was also called to Parliament, where he voted in favor of religious reform. Once Henry had founded his own Church of England, he granted himself an annulment. Henry and Anne traveled to France to secure Francis I's approval of their marriage. Mary Boleyn was one of Anne's attending ladies on the trip. On the voyage home, with their union secured, though not yet sanctified, Henry and Anne finally consummated their relationship. One has to wonder what Mary was thinking, stuck on a ship with her ex-lover, who was now besotted with her sister. Mary and George attended Anne's coronation in 1533. She was visibly pregnant when the crown of St. Edward was placed upon her head. The baby turned out to be a daughter, Elizabeth. The birth of another girl was a disappointment to the king. Mary eloped with William Stafford, a nearly penniless soldier and second son of a knight. When she became pregnant and was forced to reveal the marriage, her family was furious. As queen, Anne could have secured her a much more prestigious match, and the ambitious Boleyns couldn't comprehend Mary throwing away such an opportunity. The family disowned Mary. She wrote to her father, mother, and brother, but they ignored her. She wrote to Anne that she might have chosen a greater man of birth, but never one who should have loved her so well. She went on, "I had rather beg my bread with him than be the greatest queen in Christendom, and I believe verily he would not forsake me to be king." Anne relented and sent her sister a gold cup and some money, but the sisters never met again. In 1536, Anne miscarried a son. Henry was growing frustrated with her failure to provide him with a male heir, and, as was his MO, the king's eye had wandered to one of her maids of honor, Jane Seymour. Anne's enemy, Thomas Cromwell, began to build a case against her. It was illegal to torture members of the aristocracy, so he targeted a court musician, Mark Smeaton. In agony, he confessed to having slept with the queen, and he named 4 other noble courtiers as Anne's lovers: Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, Sir William Brereton, and Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The accusation of incest was particularly damning and helped to secure the case against the queen. Cromwell presented his flimsy evidence to the king, who was all too eager to believe it. Unaware that his fate was sealed, George was expected to be named a Knight of the Garter, but the king gave the honor instead to one of George's rivals. A week later, Anne watched as George fought gallantly in a May Day jousting tournament. The next day, the siblings were arrested. All 4 accused noblemen denied the charges and proclaimed Anne's innocence. There was virtually no evidence against them. George's wife Jane has long been vilified for providing evidence against him out of jealousy towards Anne. But that was not the case. Her only mention in the trial records was that she confessed Anne had told her Henry was not able to satisfy a woman, and he had neither capacity nor virility. This evidence was incriminating as it gave Anne motive for adultery. Nevertheless, the majority of courtiers believed in George's innocence. He argued his own case in court so persuasively that wagers were made 10-1 in favor of his acquittal. But the king wanted to be rid of his wife, so justice was thrown out the window. George's own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, sat on the jury and condemned him to death. With George's conviction, Anne's guilt was a foregone conclusion. She was sentenced and locked in the Tower of London. She could see from a window as her brother and the 4 other men accused with her were led to Tower Hill. They had been condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, but the gracious king commuted it to mere beheading. Loquacious as ever, George gave a long final speech, which so enraptured the mob that there was ne'er a boo or jeer. It was not considered honorable to deny guilt on the scaffold. But George did blame bad luck for his circumstances, insinuating his innocence. Finally, he spoke of his religious convictions, then calmly laid his head on the block. The men's heads were not spiked on London Bridge, as was tradition for traitors. Rather, they were buried with their bodies. George was laid to rest in the Royal Chapel of St. Peter ad Vicula. 2 days later, Anne was laid next to him. Thomas and Elizabeth were devastated by the deaths of their children. It is not known if they ever saw Mary or any of their grandchildren again. The Boleyns lost their court positions and the earldom of Ormond. They returned to Hever Castle in disgrace. Elizabeth died just 2 years after her children's deaths, at the age of 57. Thomas followed her to the grave a year later. The Boleyn family home was inherited by the author of their destruction, King Henry. He granted it to his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, as part of her annulment settlement. She brought new life to the castle after escaping her murderous husband. Over the centuries, Hever Castle changed hands numerous times and fell into disrepair. In 1903, it was purchased by American millionaire William Waldorf Astor, who restored the historic residence to the glorious condition we see it in today. Though she was the least ambitious Boleyn sibling, Mary was the only one to survive the spring of 1536. Little is known of her life after her sibling's death. She and William had 2 more children, Edward and Anne, who was named in her late aunt's honor. Mary died of an unknown cause in her mid-40s. Her 2 elder children, Catherine and Henry, were favored when their cousin and possible half-sister, Elizabeth I, came to the throne. Elizabeth and Catherine formed a close bond. She was named Chief Lady of the Bedchamber, the highest-ranking female position at court. She oversaw her cousin's elaborate hair, makeup, and dressing, all while carrying 14 children. Henry married Anne Morgan, and they had 16 children. He served as a member of Parliament, was created Baron of Hunsdon, a Knight of the Garter, Master of the Queen's Hawks, and was the Queen's personal bodyguard. His ultimate achievement was to become Lord Chamberlain, in which role he was a patron of Shakespeare's theatre company, known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Queen Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was a direct descendant of Catherine Carey. Thus, Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III are descendants of Mary Boleyn. Mary was brought into the public consciousness by the 2001 Philippa Gregory novel The Other Boleyn Girl and the 2008 film adaptation in which she was played by Scarlett Johansson and Anne was portrayed by Natalie Portman. While the novel and film admirably brought this long-forgotten woman to light, both were heavy on romance, distorted many historic events and characters, and made Mary seem all the more lovable by pitting the sisters against each other and painting Anne as manipulative and heartless, which was far from the truth. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast. A special thank you goes to my patron, Brittany Ross. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other royal history videos. If you really want to help, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A link is in the description. Thank you for watching.